doing Daf Yudalid, which was today's daf, which we didn't really get into so much, and we pick up in the middle of Yudalid Amud Aleph, where it's Ma'elu Yiteret al Harishonot. Okay, so we have been discussing the difference or the shift from the early fasts to the medium and to the later fasts. And most recently, we did have a fascinating discussion about the way in which some of these things might be different between Avelut and shedding some light on what are the practices of Avelut about. But getting back to the issue of the fasting, the most immediate discussion that we had was the question about shifts in the liturgy, the idea that when it becomes the more Taanit Tzibur, you say Anenu, but that there's also a shift. The way the Gemara sort of seemed to conclude is that when you, at the very first three, you say the 19 brachot, you add Anenu as a separate bracha. The last 7, you do 24 brachot, and the middle was a question which category they fell into. But we've already introduced like an increasing change in terms of the liturgy, in terms of that, and also we know this difference about matri'im and the teva. So there's a lot of ways in which the liturgy, the tefillot, and the prayers are much weightier at the end. So we're dealing with the gradations here of seriousness. Again, to remind you that in the first 3, you only fast in the day. The middle ones, you start the night before. You start with the extra inuyim, and then the last one, in addition to closing the stores, the real way it's different is with these added components about the brachot, the teva, and the matri'im. And that's therefore what we look at now. We turn to that part of the Mishnah. So ma elu yiterot al rishonot, ela shebe'elu matri'im v'nolim et hachanuyot. So the way in which the last 7 are the weightiest, you already are starting the night before. You already have the inuyim. The way they are the weightiest is the more real emphasis of the change in the types of tefillot. You do matri'in, which we'll discuss what that means, but it means blasts, and you lock the stores, close the stores, so it's really a complete day where everything shuts down and everybody is focusing on the tefillot. So now we're going to focus on what this word matri'im means. But my matri'im, how do you do this blast? So we'll see what it means. Rav Yehuda Omer b'shofarot. Shofar, which makes sense, right? That's what we associate with the word tru'ah. And what's the relevance of shofar? I'll talk about in a minute, but let's just see the other opinion. Rav Yehuda Braid Rav Shmuel Bashelas Mishmei Rav Amar Be'anenu. So he actually says no. Matri'in, although it's the word of teruah, it really means a special tefillah that you say anenu. And that's the way you call out. Now, what do you mean anenu? We said that you start saying anenu here in the first 3, right? By the last 7, you're doing 6 extra brachot. So what does this anenu mean? So let's start by looking at Rashi on anenu, and then we're going to go back to shofarot. So if you look at Rashi says the following. He says, Rav Yehuda Amar, it's like 4 lines before the lines get wide. He says, Matri'im anenu b'koram hayutzoakim. So that's the matri'im, like a yelling out, like you're making a wailing sound. Anenu avinu, anenu, anenu hey Avram, anenu, anenu hey Yitzchak, anenu. And we're going to see later that this is the whole structure of the extra 6 brachot that are added in the Shemona Esrei. So Anenu really relates to these 6 brachot, and maybe saying it in the Shemona Esrei and saying it outside of the Shemona Esrei. This is one of the earliest, by the way, texts of liturgy, other than, of course, Shemona Esrei that we have, is the Anenu, which is already like, something that we say at Slichot, which Rashi recognizes. Hakol k'fi she'omrim b'sof ha-Slichot, right? When you're done with Slichot, you say that standard Anenu hey Avram, Anenu, Anenu hey Yitzchak, Anenu, right? Everybody knows that. I don't think people are aware that is like one of the earliest liturgies that's not the Shemona Esrei. All right, and that was the center of the Shemona Esrei. That's what those extra 6 brachot were structured around the Anenus, as we'll see. And maybe Rashi is suggesting they even did it separate from the Shemona Esrei as well. Aval Anenu did tefillat ta'anit, but the special bracha of Anenu, Omer afilu b'rishonot afilu v'yachid ukimna de Omer b'shomei tefillah. So we're not talking about this Anenu. We're talking about the, Anenu el hey Avraham Anenu, Anenu el hey Yitzchak Anenu, and that's the matri'im. Okay, so that's what one idea of matri'im means. Now, how does that fit the language of matri'im? Because I'll remind you that the word teruah, we basically, when we learned Rosh Hashanah, comes from an idea of a wail. Right, a teruah is a blast, but it's a blast that they understand means a wailing, right? A sobbing, or like a rapid sobbing, right? It's a type of a wail and a sob. So that's what that's how this one is being interpreted. Not with the shofar, it's with your own voices. But you don't just say it as you're reading the siddur. You sob it, you cry it out. And that's what you're doing, and that's emphasizing like not just the text of the tefillah, but the mode, sort of energy that has to be part of how the tefillah is done. That's the idea of be'anenu. Okay, that's why you have to understand it shows that verb. Why didn't it just say you say anenu? There's a point of sort of expressing it in that way of matri'im. Now, what's the idea of shofarot? So if you look earlier at Rashi says b'shofarot, hayu osim hatraot v'loshen hatra'a k'mo tirua, like the normal trua. V'stam trua pshuta lefanev lachareb Masechtas Rosh Hashanah. We know it has a tekiah before and after. V'hachi matri'im b'shofarot k'dichsiv utkatem b'chatzot tzrot. It says you blow in the chatzot tzrot, and why does it say you blow in the chatzot tzrot? It says right. It says al hatzar hatzorer etchem right v'ariyatem b'chatzot tzrot right when you have an enemy that's oppressing you when bad things are happening. So we have the idea of a chatzot tzrot as a way of calling out to God when bad things are happening. So tokim b'shofaro kedei sheyachniu libam l'kol hashofar v'yu nirta'im mechatatam. Okay, so now Rashi, in a way, gives us the two ideas of the Torah, which I'll remind you are the two ideas we had by the Tkiyot of Rosh Hashanah. Remember, the ideas that I developed by Rosh Hashanah is that one is a prayer, a way of reaching out to God, and the other is a way of waking us up and calling on us to do tshuva. And Rashi, in a way, brings both of those together here, right? That the idea of the chatzot tzrot is we blow the chatzot tzrot. Presumably this is a way that will be remembered by God, a way of calling out to God, and the other idea is that it sort of wakes us up and motivates teshuvah. Again, as I've been saying, teshuvah is not a dominant theme so far here at all. Okay, so we have two ideas. One is you actually use a shofar. The other is you wail. But presumably, I would emphasize not the teshuvah aspect of Rashi, but these are two modes of saying how you really have to, give that power to your tefillot. Either use a shofar to do it, or to use not a chatzotzot, which is the model Rashi is basing off. You could have used the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, but a shofar is a way of giving power to the reaching out and the calling out, or through a wailing and through the saying of a name. So let's continue. So the Gemara says like this: Kasal kadaitach, we are assuming that mandamar be'anenu lo amar b'shofarot, that they're mutually exclusive. The one who says anenu doesn't believe that you do shofarot. Umandamar b'shofarot, and the one that says shofarot, lo amar be'anenu, doesn't say anenu, like it's one or the other. That you have no fewer than 7 taniyot on the tzibur. It's an interesting no fewer. Meaning once you're in the last segment, you have no fewer than 7. And in each of these taniyot, you have 18 tiruot or hatraot. Siman ledavar yiricho, and the way to remember this is yiricho. Now, what's the siman of yiricho? So must mean that that's a siman of blowing the shofar, and that you know that a way that you're answered is by blowing the shofar. So, and why do you have 18? Because if you've got, if you do 6, if you do right, as I said, the anenus, each one of the anenus, if you jump ahead for a minute, if you take a look at the next page, it's at Vav Amud Aleph, okay, where it talks about the 6 extra brachot in the Mishnah. It says like this. It says. It's about like right after where it says Yirmiyah Yudalit in the inner margin between the Gemara and Rashi. It says the word chotamehem. So do the next word there. It says Al Rishona Hu Omer, on the first of the extra 6 brachot you say Mishanas Avram Avinu Bahar Moriah Hu Yanev Yishmak B'Kol Tza'akaschem Hayom Hazeh Baruch Hashem Goel Yisrael. So the extra brachos are structured on this misha'ana, right, which is also this type of an anenu structure. So you have 6 extra brachot, right, and they are a type of a misha'ana leh, right, and there are also parallels, a type of anenu, Elohei Avraham, anenu, etc. So if there's 6 segments of anenus, then 6 times 3, because it's a tekiah before and after, gets you 18. All right, so that's why it says no fewer than 18, because we're talking about 6 segments of anenu, and in each segment there's a tekiah, trua tekiah, presumably in Shmona Esrei. All right, so you see that there's this idea of shofar. So the Gemara says, and that's a challenge to the one that says that you only do anenu as the way you cry out and not with the shofar. So the Gemara says, Ella, so you're right. Shofars techuyam lo pligi. Everybody does not debate that you would blow the shofar. The karele hatra'ah, and that's referred to as hatra'ah, like it says in this brayta we said, no fewer than 18 hatra'ot. The only hatra'ot that are 18 are shofar blasts. So everybody admits that the word hatra'ah can mean shofar blasts and that you would do shofar blasts. So then what's the debate? Umar savar lo karele hatra'ah, I'm sorry, ki pligi ba'anenu. The debate is whether you would say anenu. Mar savar karele hatra'ah, umar savar lo karele hatra'ah. One believes that that would be called hatra'ah and would be included when it says matri'im, that the way the last three are more important is by is by doing matri'im. So everybody agrees when we say you're matri'im by the last, it means you do the shofar. Okay, and that's siman ledavar yiricha, right? That's that right that we just read. And there's going to be 18 of them because it's 6 brachot times 3. Okay, the question is so everybody agrees that that's the bright that we have. But does the idea of matri'im also include the idea of anenu? That's the question. Does matri'im, the word definitely means shofarot, as we've seen. Does it also mean anenu?
Meaning can you do either one?
Or do both, presumably. Do you have to do, when it says you do matri'im in the last 7, does it mean shofar and anenu or just shofar? Presumably it means and. Okay, so it says like this. Okay, where are we? So Mar savar karele hatra'ah, Mar savar lo karele hatra'ah. So Lamandamar be'anenu kol shkein b'shofarot. So the one that said matri means anenu, of course you do the shofarot. But the point is, in addition to the shofarot, you do the anenu. Lamandamar b'shofarot, but the one that only mentioned shofarot, aval be'anenu lo, you would not do the anenu. You would just do the shofarot. Okay, so that's presumably the debate, whether you also do the anenu, if that's also being included in the Mishnah as a point of difference between the last 7 and the earlier ones. So the Gemara says like this, 1 minute. Vatanya, we taught in Brisa, v'shar kol minei puraniyot, mitrakshot, other types of bad things that are mitrakshot is like that are sort of about to come, like lihitragesh means to excite yourself. So the other types of bad things that are like anticipated, that sort of anticipating, they're like exciting themselves that they're about to come, so that you're anticipating their possible arrival. Kigon, chichuch, chagav, zevuv, v'tzir'av, yitushim, v'shiluch, nechashim, v'akravim, all different types of infestations of locusts and bugs and snakes and scorpions. Lo hayu matri'im, they would not do when they would fast for those. It would not be with matri'im. Ela tsoakim. All they would do is cry out. So that makes it clear that matri'im doesn't mean cry out. Since the word tzoakim obviously means verbal crying out, so hatra'ah b'shofarot. So you see the word hatra'ah is used in contradistinction to tzoakim, and it only means shofarot. It does not include the idea of calling out verbally. Is that clear? Right? You see that? Right? It says in these times you would verbally cry out, you would not do matri'im. So clearly matri'im does not include the idea of verbal crying out. It's just shofarot. So the Gemara says no. Tanai. It's a debate of Tanaim about what that word means to include. The Taanit, we taught in the Brayta, al elu matri'im b'Shabbat. The following things you would matri'im on Shabbat. Okay, al ir shekifua gayas, on a city that has been surrounded by troops. Oh, nahar, or is it's like there's a fear that the river will overflow. Val svina miturefes biyam, or a boat that is like in the middle of a sea storm and it might imminently drown, capsize. All of those things are urgent enough that you would even do it on Shabbat. You would be matri'im, which either means shofarot or shofarot and anenu. That's up for debate. Rabbi Yossi Omer, now Rabbi Yossi says, la'azara, when can you do matri'im for those things? To call for help. Like these are things which, forget about, calling out to God. Let's try to get some people to help us, save this city that's surrounded by troops or the boat that's about to sink. So you could do the matri'im to call for help. Avo lo litza'aka, not to cry out to God. Okay, it's fascinating. So, but again, it shows, I think Chazal's, very this worldly approach. Like if we can, the more pressing issue right now is not prayer, but it's calling people to help, the people, to lend a hand. So that's what Rabbi Yossi says. That you can do on Shabbat, call people to lend a hand. You cannot do it for prayer. So now, what are we talking about? Well, the words here is matri'im, and he says you're matri'im to call for help. So presumably that means verbally call for help. Blowing the shofar is not specific enough to get people to come and help if there's about to be an overflooding of the river. So b'mai, what are you calling people with, according to Rabbi Yossi? Ilim b'shofarot. Now the Gemara has another issue. If it's shofarot, besides what I said, that it wouldn't help call people as effectively, shofarot b'Shabbos misharya. Since when can you blow a shofar on Shabbat? Now that's a little disturbing, because if a river's about to overflow, people's lives are at risk. Of course, you can do anything you need to do. But presumably the Gemara means it on the earlier position, because the earlier position said you're matri'im even to God, not just matri'im to call for people to help. So the Gemara doesn't believe that anything would justify blowing the shofar as a form of tefillah. We don't even do it for God's sake on Rosh Hashanah. We don't blow the shofar on Shabbat. So you do not blow the shofar on Shabbat as a type of prayer. Okay, so therefore that we cannot be talking about that if we're talking about doing it on Shabbat. Elulav be'aneinu. So obviously what we're talking about here, and one could also say it's implicit in Rabbi Yossi, who talks about verbally calling for help, we're talking about anenu. The karile hatra'ah, and it uses the verb matri'im to refer to anenu. Shma mina. So you see that the word hatra'ah can refer, and for some braitos, not just to shofar, but also to anenu. Now, I will say that what's a little bit confusing of this Gemara is the Gemara just asking a technical question of what this term means, or is it asking what actually you would do in these last 7? Because I got to tell you, as we're going to see tomorrow's daf in the next parak, there is no question that in these last 7, you both blow the shofar, you do it part of the Shemona Esrei in the Misha'ana, right? So presumably you also have the anenu that goes with it. So is there really a debate of what you're doing, or is it just a debate of technically what does the word matri'im mean in the Mishnah? What is the Mishnah highlighting as the difference? Is it highlighting the shofar, or is it highlighting the anenu? I think it's easier to believe that rather than to think that the other opinion does not believe that you actually said anenu. And then again, I think that that's a fascinating question, which is, what do we think is going to be the effective way of getting to God? Do we want to highlight the use of a shofar? Maybe we have to involve more ritual or involve, more equipment, and in order to do it, or maybe it's just the way that we're praying and the type of, emotions that we are bringing to our prayers. But again, clearly the whole point here is you got to do extra. It's not enough to daven from the siddur. You got to bring your emotions to this, and you have to be matri'im. And then the question is whether that's emphasizing the use of the shofar or emphasizing the way in which we're praying. Okay, now we move on. B'shani de Rabbi Yehuda Nisiya Havetzara. In the years of Rabbi Yehuda Nisiya, who was the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so he was in the Amoraic period, there was a tsa'ar. It's not clear what it was. Maybe it wasn't rain. Maybe it was one of these other tsarot that we heard of. But something that warranted a Taanit. So Gazar Klatetre Taniyot, and he went for the whole complement, the whole 13. And they weren't answered, like the Mishnah says. What happens after 13? They're not answered. So what does the Mishnah say happens after 13 that they're not answered? Do you remember?
Stop.
You stop doing the Taanit, Yechidim maybe continue, and you start doing Avelut. So let's see what Rabbi Yehuda Nisiya did. Savar Lemingzer Tfei, he wanted to make on the Tzibur more than the 13. Okay, we know that's only something for Yechidim to do. Amalei Rabbi Yami said to him, Harei Amru, Ein Matrichim Al Tzibur Yoter Midai. They said, apparently there was a statement said as an explanation to why you stop after 13, that you do not put that burden on the community more than they can bear. 13 is enough. So now becomes the question, why do you think we stopped at 13? Okay, let's for a moment take a step back. The Mishnah says after 13, then they act like Bnei Adam Henizofim Lamakom, and they stop. Why do they stop? Is it that you feel if God hasn't answered after 13 attempts, it's like God clearly isn't answering, it's going to be no point, purposeless? Is it, if that's true, that should have applied here? Is it because you don't want to overburden the community? At a certain point we have to say enough, then it should have applied here. But maybe there's also something that was unique to the rain issue. Yes, because if you remember, the end of the Mishnah says, and if it rained too late, like by Nisan time, then it's a Siman Klala. Now, after 13, you're not in Nisan time. After 13, you're talking about what? Like, I didn't exactly do the math, but if it's 2 a week, you're talking about like 7-8 weeks or something like that, depending on when you start or whatever. So Cheshvan Kislev Tevet, you're in the middle of Tevet. It's not after Nisan. But still, there's a point that after a certain point, the rain is not going to make that much of a difference, So maybe that's part of why we stop. So let's take a look. That's what's at stake here. So he says, look, it's an issue of Tircha, we should stop. Amar Rabbi Yava Breda Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Rabbi Ami Da'avad Legarmehu Da'avad. So Rabbi Ami that is saying, oh, you're not supposed to be matriach yochemidai, that's a nice Torah, and he can say that for himself, but meaning it's a way of sort of dismissing it. That's not, go teach that to yourself. That's not really the reason. Why? So Ela Hachi Amar Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. This is what Rabbi Chia Bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Something quite different. Lo shanu elu l'gishamim. When do we say you stop at 13 when it's about rain? Aval l'shar minei peraniyot, but for all other bad things that are about to happen or are happening, mitanim v'ochim ad sheya'anu min hashamayim. You fast until there's some relief. You keep on praying and fasting. You never give up hope until there is some relief, and therefore you don't stop at 13. Now, I think there's something very beautiful about that, because about sort of saying, like, we never stop believing that God will eventually answer our prayers, and maybe he hasn't been answering until now, but it never leads to a sense of despair about that, which is very different than the way the Mishnah ends. The Mishnah ends like everybody is in despair. God has rejected you. End of story. Like there's no sense of what comes after, right? Here, no matter how long it's been going on, we never despair. We keep at it. Eventually, we'll be answered. Yes. Right, and the only reason you stop by the rain, I'm sorry, I meant to say that, but going back to what we said, and therefore the reason we stop by rain is because just by the rain, there's no point in continuing. Even if God were to answer us now, it wouldn't do any good. It's too late for the rain. So it's not that we're despairing of the relationship or of the possibility that God would answer. It's just that it's like too late. It's like if somebody's praying for someone to get better and he dies, you stop praying for the person to get better, right? So that's like the point of, that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, is it's just about rain, because after a certain point it's too late. But if the problem still exists, you never give up. You keep on praying. Okay, Tanya Namihachi, we taught similarly, Kishamu Shalosh, Kishamu Sheva, Lo Amr El Geshamim. So when they sort of said these 3 and 3 and 7, that was about rain, and it was about spacing it that way and so on. Aval shamrein praniyot mitanim v'hochim ad sheya'anu. But all the other fasts, you keep, for other reasons, you keep on doing it until you're answered. I have to say I don't understand exactly what it means when they said 3 and when they said 7. It should see when they said 13, because 13 was the limit, right? Like other fasts, it's more about when you end. It's, is there a different? Why should that affect how you structure it in terms of 3, 3, and 7? Right? That's not so clear. Unless what it means is that a little delayed rain isn't so tragic right away if it came a little late. So we don't start the heavy fasts right away. Whereas if there's about to be pestilence or there's about to be marauding troops, we start the heavy fasts right away. Like that's not a gradual concern. So that might be the reason it says not only is it the fact that you don't end, but maybe you can even start on a heavier note with those other things. Okay, so let's say all of this is a proof against Rabbi Ami, who said that it's all about tircha d'tzibur, and it would be, the limit would apply to everything. So the Gemara says, Amalacha Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami would say back to you, Tanai, it's a debate of Tanai, the Tanya we turn to the Brisa, Ein Godvim Yosem Shlosh Tzrei Taniyot Al HaTzibur, if he Shein Matrichin Et HaTzibur Yotem Midai. So he has a Brisa that says exactly what he said. The reason of not more than 13 is you don't want to burden the community. Divrei Rabbi, that's what Rabbi says. So that's who I'm going like. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Reb Shimon Gamliel says, Lo min Hashem, who said that's not the reason. El mitnei sheyatzaz mana shel reviyah, because the time of the rain has passed. So exactly this debate of Hamoraim is an explicit debate and a breita between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Is this unique to rain because it's already too late? Or is this a general issue of just at a certain point you got to stop and get back to your life? I have to say, even the idea of stopping and getting back to your life is matrichin tzibur is much better than the idea of bnei adam hanizofim lemakom, which is a complete sense of like despair about the relationship. So it's a different thing to say, like reality has to kick in at a certain point. Okay, so anyway, but that's the two reasons that are presented, whether it's unique to rain or not. Shalchulei bnei Ninveh l'Rebbe. Now, about this issue of when is the right time, we get back to a question that came up before about different places need rain at different times. So the people of Nineveh, fascinating to mention Nineveh here because they're coming up in the, pretty soon about how Nineveh is a model of people that, did tshuva. So the Bnei Nineveh sent to Rebbe, Kigon Anan da'afilu b'tkufas tamuz be'inan mitra. We need rain even in the summer. So, normally you stop asking in the spring. By Pesach time, we need it even in the summer. So, Heichi Navi, how should we act? Ki Yechidin Daminan or Ki Rabim Daminan? Are we like Yechidim or are we like Rabim? Again, this Yechidim and Rabim theme. Now, what do they mean by that? We've seen a distinction of Yochid and Rabim in terms of fasting, right? So is that what they mean? Let's see what they mean. So say, so the Gemara doesn't interpret it about fasting. Should we do it like a Taanit Yochid or Taanit Tzibur? It interprets it as in terms of davening. Should we do it? Should we consider ourselves just like Yechidim who are fasting, and say it in Shomea Tefillah? Well, let's see what we're saying. Are we like Yechidim and do it b'Shomea Tefillah? O Kirabim Daminan u'b'Birchat Hashanim. Now, all of a sudden, it shifts gears to what we were expecting. Probably until now, at least what I was expecting is, the contrast to Shomea Tefillah is when do we say the Rabbim say Anenu? Not in Shomea Tefillah, but when? Being Goel L'Rofe, right, as a separate bracha. What do you mean Birchas Hashanim? What do we say in Birchas Hashanim? So what's one thing we do say in Birchas Hashanim that relates to this? Right, we say Tein Talumata Livracha. So all of a sudden, 1 minute, you're asking a different question. You're not asking that you're fasting and is it a Taanit Yochid versus Taanit Tzibur. You're asking maybe you're not even fasting. Maybe you're just asking we need to say Tein Talumata. And do we say it in Shomea Tefillah or do we say it in Birchas Hashanim? Normally Birchas Hashanim you only say it until Pesach, but in our entire city, our entire region, if you remember, I mentioned the Rosh's Tshuva. I'll mention it again in a minute. In our entire region, we need rain much later. Maybe we should keep on saying Birchas Hashanim through the period that we need rain. Saying Tein Talumata. So that's the question. Nothing to do with the Taanit, just the saying of Tein Talumata. Okay, and again, the way you can notice that it's not about the Taanit, now that we realize this and go back, is it didn't say that it didn't rain. It didn't say B'nai Nineveh sent to Rabbi and saying it's not raining. What are we doing? They're just saying, as a regular course of events, we need the rain even in the summer. Right? Do you see that? How they're phrasing their questions? Right? They said, Kigonanan dafilu b'tkufas tamuz. They're saying, regularly, nothing bad is happening right now. It's just a general question. Forget Taanit. Regularly, we need rain in the summer. How do we make that request for rain? Do we say it in Shomea Tefillah or do we say it in Birchas Hashanim? Shalchulahu, he sent to them, Ki Yechidim Damisu, you're like individuals. Ubishomea Tefillah, you say it in Shomea Tefillah. The basic point is that the Tzibur, all of Klal Yisrael, well, not really, because Eretz Yisrael is different than Chutz La'aretz, but the shift in the liturgy is like for everyone. Okay, and therefore the saying Tein Talumata Livracha stops at Pesach for everyone. If your region still needs rain later, then you go ahead and you say it in Shomea Tefillah. So you're a small exception, but the rule still is of the standard liturgy applies to everyone. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Meisvei, I'll ask you on that. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amasai. When is it, presumably, that you say, Tein Talumata Livracha according to the schedule that we've mentioned, Zayin Mar Cheshvan, or 60 days afterwards, after the Tkufa and Bavel, when everything is in its right place. The years are normal, Israel's in its land, okay? Aval, Bizman Hazeh, nowadays, Hakol Lefi Hashanim, Hakol Lefi Makomot, Hakol Lefi Hazman. It all depends on the situation you find yourself in, what you need, what's going on this year, when the rain is most needed this year, in that location when rain is most needed, for that time when the rain is most needed. Everything follows like a year-by-year assessment. Crazy idea, right? That saying Tein Talumata Livracha would change year by year and community by community based on when they would need rain. Okay, so you see, it says it does change. It's not a fixed thing that everybody does the same way. So Amar Lei, she said back to him, Masnisa Ramis Alei de Rebbe? You're challenging Rebbe with a Braita? Rebbe Tana, who Pali? Rebbe is a Tana. He has his own opinion. So here we have a fascinating possibility that you would say Tein Talumata Livracha in Birchas Hashanim, either based, on every year and every community and every geographic region, based on what's appropriate for that time. But Rebbe says that's fixed. Anything that's special for you guys, say it in Shomea Tefillah. So what's the halacha? My have Allah. What was the conclusion? Rav Nachman Amar b'Birchas Hashanim, Rav Sheshes Amar b'Shomea Tefillah. The Hilchasa b'Shomea Tefillah. Okay, so that is what we do. Even if a community still needs rain at a later time, even as a regular thing, that region always needs rain later than Pesach, you stop saying Tein Talamatar when it comes Pesach, and if you need to continue saying it because you need to continue asking for rain, you ask for it in Shomei Tefillah. Okay, now that makes sense that there should be a pretty consistent liturgy, but again, let's also acknowledge that it is different between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. And I want to remind you, I think I mentioned this before, that the Rosh dealt with this question when he moved to Toledo and became the rabbi there, and he said there they needed rain, after Pesach. And people were not only asking about saying Anenu in Shomei Tefillah, they were actually having fasts because it wasn't raining and they need rain as a regular basis after Pesach. And the Rosh says, I couldn't believe this. They were fasting for rain and they weren't saying Tein Talamatar Livracha. Now he says, what about this Gemara? This Gemara basically reflects that. He says, this Gemara is talking about, the people of Nineveh, that's a city. Saying we're talking about like an entire country. We're talking about a whole major geographic area. So if there could be a different rule for Eretz Yisrael and a different rule for Bavel, so there should be a different rule for Spain. I'm not talking about a city. I'm talking about a huge country. Okay, and he said that this is, and says it's not like we paskin like the Bavli and we have to do what Bavel does. Bavel is different because they needed different needs for rain. So Spain should be like Bavel and have its own calendar for saying Tein Talamatar Livracha. So the Rosh says, I was soveach kikruchia, I screeched like a crane for leis to mishkachbi, and nobody listened to me. So he says it all fell on deaf ears. And basically, bottom line is, we paskin that even if an entire country has a different schedule, once it comes Pesach, you stop saying Tein Talamatar. You can say it in Shomei Tefillah, but you stop saying it in Birchas Hashanim, even if the entire country still needs rain at that period. It's pretty interesting. Okay, the one point is that if accidentally you said it in Birchas Hashanim, and this is something that's needed for your country, then you don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. But we basically paskin against the Rosh and apply this idea of Nineveh to even very large geographic regions.
You don't repeat the Shema saying, you do say something in Shema Tefillah, or you don't say
You do, like the Gemara says here. Obviously it's not exactly.
You said it already.
Oh, no, once you accidentally said it in Birchas Hashanim, you wouldn't say it again in Shomei Tefillah. Okay, but yeah. Okay, so what have we concluded here? One thing we've concluded is that Matri'im, the big way the last 7 are different, with Shofar and Anenu, both about not just a saying of Tefillot, but a way of calling out and screeching out, etc. We've discussed the issue of when you stop at the end of 13, is that just for rain? Because after a certain point, it's not doing any good. And is that the reason why you stop? Or is the reason that, and then for other things you would continue, you would never give up hope? Or is the reason that you stop because of Ein Matrichen et HaTzibur, and then it would be universal? And now we've looked at the issue of Tein Talamatar, going back to a standard liturgy question, not the general issue of Taanit and sort of exceptional cases. And would that change region by region? And the answer basically is no. Okay, moving on. So on Mondays, this is now when the stores are closed in the last 7. So on Mondays, you would incline, which basically Rashi says means like you wouldn't exactly open the store for regular for business, but you'd make it available for people that needed it as it's starting to get dark. And on Thursdays, the whole day, because in order to help people prepare for Shabbat. So that's within the parameters of keeping the stores open or closed. So the Gemara says, Ibailu, Heichik Tani. What does that Mishnah mean? How are we, what does it mean to be saying? So does it mean, does the verb matin, which means like you incline, like you sort of have it half open, does that refer both to Mondays and to Thursdays? And the whole difference is the amount of time. By Mondays, you sort of open it as needed near nightfall, and by Thursdays, it's open as needed the whole day. So the basic difference is how long do you have that type, that availability. Odioma, or maybe maybe Thursdays is more radically different. Odioma b'sheni matim, on Mondays towards nightfall, you open it up like as needed. Ubechamishi, but on Thursdays, potchim kol hayom. You open it regularly for business. So that's a radical difference. That means that on Thursday, the whole idea of closing the stores really only applied to the Mondays. It didn't apply to the Thursdays, right? You get that, right? So that's the question. Now I will remind you that of every threesome, it's Sheni, Chamishi, and Sheni. There are 2 more Mondays than Thursdays. So even if it does only apply, but this is a 7. So this would actually forget that point because this is a 7. So this would have 4 Mondays and 3 Thursdays. But still, this read would have it only really closed a little more than half the time. So Tashma coming here. The time we turn Brisa b'sheni matim ad ha'erev, and on Mondays you sort of make it available until the evening. Ubechamishi potchim kol hayom kulo. So yes, Thursdays it's fully open mipnei kvod Shabbat in order to let people purchase for Shabbat. Hayulo shnei ptachim. Now even there, maybe there's a little bit that you're not fully business as usual. If there's 2 entrances, poteach echad v'nochel echad. You don't have both doors open. Like normally you have 2, like think of a Macy's, right? You have 10 different entrances, ways you can get in. No, you only have 1 door that's open. I mean, the store is fully open, but only one of the entrances is open. Hayulo itztaba kineged pitcho, poteach kedarko ve'eno choshesh. If, however, you have a booth in front of your door, then you can fully open, and not have to worry. Now, what does fully open mean? Does it mean you can open both doors because the booth slows down traffic a little bit? Rashi says something even more than that. If you look at Rashi, again, about 6 lines before the lines get wide, Potech Kidarko, Rashi says, Afilu b'sheni. So if you have a booth in front of your store, so when the doors are open, it's not so public, it's not so obvious that the doors are open because there's a little booth in front of it, you can even have your store open on a Monday. So that seems to be like a real loophole to get around this, right? All you need is to put a booth in front of your store and you can be open on a Monday. It's not so clear to me that that's what the Breita means. Okay, but this is the idea that on the last set of fasts, the stores are shut down, which is a real way that the whole, community shuts down for these last 7 fasts. But obviously, to some degree, life has to continue. So there's some allowance on Monday and a much greater allowance on Thursdays. Okay. Now the 7 have passed, and now even after the whole 13, they haven't been answered. You then it's nihuge avelus. You don't have business. You limit your business, and with construction and planting. So Tana, binyan shel simcha. It doesn't mean you don't do any types of construction. I mean, you got a leaky roof. That's okay. It means you don't do things that are about types of a joyful construction. We'll see what that means. Nitya shel simcha, and similarly a joyful planting. Ezu binyan shel simcha ze abona beis chasnus livno. Like if you're basically building a wedding hall for your son, whether that means a house for him to move into after he gets married, or some type of a special chuppah that he's going to get married under. That's a simcha related binyan. Okay, and what's the ezu nitya shel simcha? What's a simcha related planting? Ze hanotea av varniki shel malachim. Some type of an orchard of kings, some type of a beautiful, backyard orchard, flower garden, those types of things you would not do. But, a gazebo, but other types of things, that's not planting, that's building. But anyway, so those are the things that you don't do. But again, not completely to outlaw these things. Here it's much more limited. It's not just an exception. What's actually forbidden is a much more limited category. Binyan and Nitiyah are being defined very narrowly. Okay, ub'she'elat shalom, and in inquiring after somebody's well-being, we say, like on Tisha B'Av, you don't even say hello, right? But it's because she'elat shalom on the one hand is a greeting, but on the other hand, she'elat shalom has the word shalom in it. It means ma shalom damar, it's about asking after somebody's welfare, greeting somebody, peace be upon you, and inquiring after their welfare, so that you understand more that if you're everybody's in mourning, you don't start saying, hey, what's happening? How's everything going? But we have translated that even to not doing a simple greeting. But I just want to make it clear that was not exactly, the Gemara didn't have hello. Okay, the Gemara She'elat Shalom was a little more than hello. Okay, so Tanu Rabbanan, we taught Chaverim Ein She'elat Shalom Beinehem. So this is now a new distinction, not Yachid v'Tzibur, but Chaver and Am Haaretz, a distinction we're more familiar with for the rabbis. Okay, so the Chaverim, the like knowledgeable rabbinic class, or those that are particularly scrupulous, they don't do any asking after welfare. Amei Haaretz Sheshoalim. Now the masses don't know that you're not supposed to greet people during this period, so they'll greet you. So what are you supposed to say? I mean, how can you be rude? So machzirim lehem b'safa rapa ubekovid rosh. You answer in like a soft, tongue and with heaviness of head. So it says, "Hey, how's everything going?" Okay. So you answer. That's how you answer. Okay. Now going beyond Sheila Shalom, people wrap themselves in their talit and they sit ka'avelim u'chmenudim. Again, avel and menudah are being put together, like mourners and like those that are in nidui, kibnei adam and nizofim lamakom, like people that are being rejected by God, until God has compassion. Part of the message I should say here implicitly is that not only are we owning what's happening to us, and that we are sort of, I think there's a power to that, to do something that expresses that you really are recognized how terrible this is and what this means, and that you're owning that, in terms of its religious significance. You're not just saying, all right, whatever, life as usual. Okay, but the other point I think that's being made here is you make yourself so miserable that maybe God finally has compassion. I think there's a sense that, that rachamim might be bestirred by the fact that you are now just completely mired in your misery. And I think it raises the question that maybe that's partly what's going on with the Taanit as well. Maybe part of the idea of a Taanit is you make yourself so miserable that maybe God will answer you. Okay, so I think that's a little bit of a subtext here. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Ein adam chashuv rishai lipol al panav, elim kein ne'ana ki Yoshua bin Nun. Now this is a little interesting what this is doing here, but I think that this is implicitly because we spoke about yichidim continuing to fast during this period. I think this is implicitly a comment on that, although we haven't repeated that point here. But during this period, yichidim continue to fast. Maybe the yichidim will be answered. So this gets to a question of who is a yachid and who might still be answered, and through what means. So here he says the following: an important person is not allowed to fall on his face, as a way of praying, unless he's answered like Yoshua bin Nun. So we know that Yoshua was answered by falling on his face. But unless you think you're like Yoshua and you have the same confidence that you're going to be answered, don't do this. So part of the message here is, it's the issue that came up earlier about yuhara, right? So it's one thing to see yourself as a yachid and to continue to fast. But what about to see yourself as a yachid? The yachid I'm going to see myself like is choni hamneagel. And I'm going to draw a circle and say, God! So that's a tremendous chutzpah. So it's an interesting, again, question of what that means to be a yachid and how that sets you apart from the tzibur and what that does in terms of the sense of your own being, special religiously. So here he's saying, I don't want some demonstrative behaviors, like none of this falling on your face unless you're like Yoshua bin Nun. Okay, the Amar Rabbi Eliezer also said, oh, you want to put on a sackcloth? So only if you'd be answered like Yoram. Now Yehoram was a wicked king, that should be mentioned. But we know he was answered. So again, the whole story, he tore his clothes, he wore the sackcloth, and he was answered. So unless you're confident that you're going to be answered by God, don't go overboard with your demonstrating your acts of, mourning and of prayer, making yourself so special. The Amar Rabbi Linzer also said, Lo hakol b'kriyah v'lo hakol b'nefila. Even when it came to the greats in the Tanakh, not everybody did all the different forms of showing their mourning and their and their misery. Not everybody rent their garments. Not everybody fell on their face. Moshe and Aaron fell on their face. Yoshua v'kalei b'kriyah. Moshe Aaron b'nefila. T'chsiv. We read this recently. Vayipol Moshe Aaron al pneihem. Now, quite interestingly, they're not falling on their face and tearing their garments to pray to God necessarily. They're falling on their face and tearing their garments because they're hearing this terrible news, right? Right? Everybody knows the story, right? Yoshua and Kalev are not tearing their garments to pray to God. They're tearing their garments because the people are, this terrible thing is happening. But that's consistent. We're no longer in the Taanit phase. We're in the Avelut phase. We're in doing certain practices to express the tragedy, not to be answered. So looking at Yoshua and Aaron and Kalev and Moshe and Aaron and Kalev and Yoshua and how they responded to the tragedy of the Meraglim is an appropriate model for this stage, the post-13 fast stage where it's about owning that tragedy. But again, what it seems that Rebbe Linzer is responding to, if you put all these statements together, which the Gemara conveniently did for us, is he saw a lot of ostentatious religious behavior going on. He saw people rending their garments and falling on their face and putting on sackcloth, and he said, look, only if you know you can be answered. And I'm going to do everything. I'm going to do this and this and this and this. Even in Tanakh, people didn't do everything. They had different forms of expressing it. Don't let, keep the showmanship to yourself. Okay, so Maskivla Reb Zeira v'Temer Reb Shmuel Bar Nachmani Yehavik Siv Yoshua. Had it said Yoshua v'Kalev ben Yefuneh, not the Yoshua k'nekamis, then it would be like you would be saying that Moshe and Aaron did one thing and Yoshua and Kalev did another thing. Hashdi the Yoshua and Yoshua and Kalev did this. Havahavid. It means they did what Moshe and Aaron did, and they also rent their garments. I don't know if that's exactly pshat, but that's what he gets out of the vav. The Amar Rebbe Linzer said, Lo kol b'kima v'lo kol b'ishtachavaya. Now we're moving beyond sort of expressions of tragedy and of prayer. And just general thing. Not everybody is, stands up, and not everybody bows down. Let's take a look. Lo kol melachim b'kima. Melachim stood up, and v'sarim b'ishtachavaya, and princes bowed down. Melachim b'kima t'chsiv. Kor Hashem goel Yisrael kedosho. Levazei nefesh lemit'av goy le'eved moshlim melachim yiru v'kamu v'sarim melachim yiru v'kamu. So it's saying to the nation that has been disgraced, and discussed and rejected, the rejected and disgraced nations, and has been ruled over by others. In the future, kings will rise up will see your glory and rise up for you to show honor. The sarim b'ishtachavaya, and princes bow down. T'chsiv sarim vayishtachavu, and the princes would bow down. So the same way, different ways of expressing grief, different ways of expressing respect. So, and don't overdo your expressions of respect either. So, Maskif la Rabbi Zeira asked on this. V'temer Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani yaviksiv v'sarim yishtachavu, and the princes will bow down to the kamret. Like you said, one will do one, the other will do the other. Hashidichsiv sarim v'yishtachavu, and they will bow down. The vav is going on the verb here, so it's an even better point than the point before about Yoshua. Hava ha'avid. It means they'll do that, they'll get up, and afterwards they'll also bow down. All right, so doing both is not so bad. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Afani Omer, as long as we're talking about this, let me say, Lo kol la'ora v'lo kol l'simcha. Not everybody will see the same end. Not everybody will have light, and not everybody will have joy. Tzadikim la'ora, the righteous will have light. The yesharim l'simcha, and the upright will have joy. The tzadikim la'ora d'chsiv, or zarua l'tzadik, u'yesharim simcha d'chsiv, u'yishrei simcha. Now that's like a funny way to end. It's nice that we're ending on a positive note, but like, what? A tzaddik doesn't get joy? And a yashar doesn't get or? And what exactly is the difference between the tzaddik and the yashar? So I think it's a fascinating ending to try to think about what's going on there. But just to repeat, the bigger thrust here is, and I think it's a very important way to end this parak, which talked about the yechidim starting and the yechidim ending. That it's one thing to be a yachid and to accept a fast and do it in private. It's another thing to start doing all of these very demonstrative ways that are not appropriate for you, not appropriate even if an adam chashuv. It's not appropriate. It's just ostentatious. And certainly, if you think you have to start doing like a lot of them, it's completely inappropriate. And there's a little pushback in the Gemara. Maybe it's not so bad to do more than one, but again, it's an interesting way to try to create like a balance of setting yourself apart from the tzibur, ways that are appropriate and ways that are not. All right, and with that we are over and we've caught up. Yeah, and we ended on time, within a minute.